Yeah, many organisations talk about the importance of taking risks, being bold, being adventurous, realising that we're going to have to experience failure and be innovative if we're going to stay at the cutting edge in the face of disruption. And while we talk about this, the verbiage of this is common in the business landscape. We know we've got to fail fast and fail frequently. The reality is very few organisations are actually following through and seeing this become a part of everyday experience or culture within an organisation. It was interesting working with one of the banks recently. I was speaking to the client before the program I was going to deliver to the leadership team. And I said, well, let's talk about innovation and how we'll build a culture of innovation. I said, let's touch on the importance of developing a healthy appetite for failure. And this client said, well, we could talk about that, but the reality is we've covered that a lot in the last 12 months, and I don't know that'd be a good place to spend our time. And I said, well, I mean, that's great. That's been discussed as a leadership team. But I said, are your people doing it? Are they taking risks? Are they bold? Are they brave? Are they being adventurous? Are they willing to and open to fail? And he sort of sheepishly said, well, the reality is not really. We still play a very safe game as an organisation. There's a natural bent toward being conservative and not wanting to fail, not wanting to be responsible for things that go wrong. And I said, well, if you're talking about it but the culture's not following through, the challenge is how do we address that? And so in the end, we actually spent a lot of time with the leadership team looking at this whole theme of how to build a culture where an appetite for healthy failure, a boldness to try new things becomes a part of everyday existence. Now it's interesting, the challenge for creating a culture where boldness is encouraged, where failure is embraced, is endemic, particularly in public organisations. When you've got share prices that can fluctuate on a whim, you want to play off in a very safe game. And the reality is, while you may well save your share price this month or your job this year, not taking risks and not being willing to experience failure may jeopardise the very long-term and even medium-term future of the organisation. So how can you incentivise boldness? How can you encourage sensible risk-taking? Not reckless, stupid risks, sensible risk-taking. 3 keys to doing this. First key, if you're going to incentivize boldness and risk-taking, is you need to create psychological safety. A great example of the importance of psychological safety is the example of Jim Donald when he stepped into the role of CEO of Extended Stay America, having come out of Starbucks as his previous role. Jim Donald arrived into an organization that had a very difficult few years. And because things had been challenging, there was a prevailing culture of playing it safe, not taking risks, not wanting to stuff up. And so Jim Donald realized he needed to address this culture and give people permission to take risks and to fail. And he had a very novel way of doing this. And he created these get out of jail free cards that were distributed to everyone in the organization. The idea was, if you take a risk, if you try something and it doesn't work, just call through your get out of jail free card, no questions asked. What he gave people is a safety net, the ability to try things without that fear that if I try something and it goes wrong, then I'm going to be punished. Now, how do you do the same sort of thing? And it doesn't have to be a get out of jail free card that someone has in the organization. Often it's about modeling the culture of psychological safety. For instance, if a risk is taken, if something new is tried and it doesn't work, what do people around the organization or the team or the person that's made that mistake, what is the culture as a response? Because so often what you see happen is this: a mistake is made and everyone steps back and they point. I wouldn't have done it. I could have told you that wouldn't work. And of course, what does that say to everyone else in the team? Don't you take a risk next, because it might be you that's left out next time. The most important thing is when a risk is taken, a mistake or a failure is experienced, you as the leader or the organization as a whole needs to step forward, gather around the person or the team that's made the mistake, and in solidarity, the whole culture response needs to be, how do we learn from this together? Do not victimize the person. Don't leave them out on a ledge, because all that'll tell everyone else is, don't you take a risk, because it might be you next time. The second key to creating a culture where failure is encouraged, where people are willing to take risks and be bold, is you need to model it. This is so important from a leadership perspective. It needs to be clear throughout the organization that you as the leader have tried things and things have gone wrong, that you've made mistakes. Because very rarely will people within an organization be willing to take a risk if the perception is that everyone at higher levels of the organization have played the game that's been a safe game, and that's been what's got them to the point where they're at. You've made mistakes. You've taken risks with things that haven't worked out. Clearly communicate that. It builds a lot of trust, but it'll also give the encouragement to those in your teams, in your organization, to take the very same risks. Boldness starts at the top. The third key to encouraging boldness is to give people a reason to do so, to actually actively incentivize boldness and risk-taking. This may well mean that every performance review, every performance dialogue, part of the discussion is, what have you tried this year that hasn't worked? And people who say, well, actually everything's worked fine, that almost is a black mark against your name, because that should be a sign that you're playing a game that is far too safe. And so the challenge for all of us is how do you encourage people to take risks, and if they've taken a risk, how do you actually celebrate that? This can even begin right at the early stages, the interview process for a new employee, that you set that as a centerpiece of the culture. Jeff Bezos, for instance, at Amazon, always asks new hires, tell me about something you've invented. Now the code there is, what have you tried? What are the risks that you've taken? What is the trail that you've blazed? Because the reality is he knows right from the outset, if he hires people who don't have that natural mentality, that bend, that will impact the culture over time. So how do you incentivize and encourage the very bold, risk-taking, inventive behavior that is going to be required if you're going to stay at the cutting edge? Frank WILCZEK, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for Physics back in 2004, said if you're not making mistakes, you're not attempting problems that are hard enough. And that is so critical. If you've not made mistakes, if there's not a culture around you where mistakes and failure are experienced, you're probably playing a game that is far too safe, and that also probably means you're not staying at the cutting edge and not sufficiently innovating in a way that will see you thrive in the age of disruption.